I am a huge fan of The Office, the original British iteration that is. I think it's near enough a perfect TV series, and there's barely any faults that I pick with it. You've got a perfectly paced story involving brilliant actors all giving hilarious and memorable dialogue that makes you laugh, but also has some heart and emotion to it too. Every element of it is executed flawlessly, and for being Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant's first big project together, it's such a huge achievement that they were able to make something as good as they initially did. The Office first aired in 2001, at a time when Ricky and Steve had known each other for a few years. Up to this point, they had previously worked together on a number of projects. These include the infamously terrible Meet Ricky Gervais series that aired on Channel 4 and has been mocked by the pair ever since.
Do you think it's acceptable to ridicule dwarves on television?
And they also worked together and were subsequently let go from their role at London-based radio station XFM, in an era that has been since dubbed Series 0 of the Ricky Gervais show by fans. So the pair definitely had a career developing together, but they were still trying to find their footing in making something they could truly be proud of. During this time period, however, in around 1998, Stephen Merchant was taking a television production course at the BBC and was required to make his own TV short. Following on from the trend at the time of fly-on-the-wall documentaries and docusoaps like the BBC's Driving School and Airport, Merchant created a short mockumentary-style demo about the Seedy boss character, alongside Asher Tala, who would later become the producer for The Office, and Ricky Gervais. This was seen and passed along through the BBC, eventually culminating in BBC Two's then network controller Jane Root ordering a full-length pilot of the Seedy boss. It was obviously liked at the BBC, and so after further changes, as well as the addition of some new ideas and the removal of some other ones, the Seedy boss eventually became The Office, one of the most revered British comedies of all time and the foundation for a now huge assortment of international spin-offs. This second pilot is, to my knowledge, not available in its uninterrupted full length anywhere and never has been. The only footage of it that I've ever seen is from an episode of the TV show Comedy Connections that centred around The Office. It shows some clips of it, and as you can see from watching them, it's pretty damn similar to the final product. Plus the casting is the same as the actual series, and as it was made only a year before The Office was first broadcast, it was made well into The Office's journey. They'd also dropped the Seedy boss name by this point and were actually calling it The Office. That original 1998 demo, however, that spawned this second pilot, is actually fully available. It was an extra that was included on the first series' DVD release, and so you can actually watch it and truly get an understanding of what Ricky and Stephen were going for, and how their initial Seedy boss idea compares to The Office. And that's what I'm going to be taking a look at today. A little low-budget experimental project from 1998 that would eventually become one of the most important and influential media products in modern British entertainment. Written and directed by Stephen Merchant and Ricky Gervais, who also plays the titular role. This is Upstairs Downstairs, a new quiz show devised by the Seedy boss demo from 1998.
Into the Fray. Braveheart, have you? It's fantastic. Have you seen that film?
No, I haven't.
Nor have I.
The phrase I'd use to best summarise the Seedy boss demo is work in progress. The foundations for something great are definitely being laid down here, but nothing feels completely fine-tuned yet. And you know, that's perfectly okay. This was an internal demo designed to show that there was a concept here that had potential, not that it was already perfected and ready to go straight to broadcast. It feeling like a work in progress is expected, because that's literally what it is. The dialogue's not quite as funny or delivered as well as in The Office, the characters' personalities and the way they're portrayed feels a bit off, the casting isn't quite right, and it's clear the camera isn't being used in a fully documentarian kind of way, but the underlying themes are all present. It's a mockumentary about a man that is a manager of a mundane office who plays up to the camera and wants everyone to like him. That man is of course David Brent, played by Ricky Gervais. In the actual series of The Office, I think David is amazing, and he's such a well-executed comedic character. In fact, I go as far to say that David Brent is one of my favourite characters in any piece of media, full stop. He's really that good. On the surface, it's easy to judge him as just a bad manager that people dislike, but there's an incredibly intricate and complex character underneath the facade that David tries to hide behind. A full analysis of David's character is not really within the scope of this video, but the point I want to make is that the show is a lot more of a character study on David than it initially appears to be, and it almost lures you into thinking he's just a wacky bad manager before opening him up and showing the complexity and rather deep nature of his character. Here, the pilot is called The Seedy Boss. Rather a blunt title, don't you think? And I think it's pretty indicative of a key difference between David in the actual series of The Office and this work-in-progress David. This demo's David is undeniably pretty rough around the edges, and in a lot of ways feels like a very different character to the one that we all know him as today. Visually, on the surface, he looks pretty similar. Obviously, he's still played by Ricky Gervais, who is admittedly noticeably skinnier and younger in this pilot, something which I think makes David not work quite as well, but it's more so the way he acts that makes him feel so different. And to demonstrate this, I'll compare a sequence that happens in this demo and was also used in the actual series, that being the scene in which David makes an incredibly awkward joke towards Dawn about her being a thief in order to try and impress the new temp, Ricky.
Oh
Ricky?
Yeah.
Ricky!
If you're interested enough to be watching videos about The Office's demo, I'm sure you're familiar with how the scene plays out in the series, seeing as it's in the very first episode. David thinks it's going to be hilarious to make Dawn think she's being fired for something she didn't do, but obviously it upsets her and makes her start crying, and then she calls David a wanker. Ricky Howard can do nothing but sit there awkwardly trying to look anywhere other than at Dawn, and David tries to rescue the situation, which is obviously completely futile. It's a great piece of cringe comedy, as not only are we watching something incredibly uncomfortable, but the viewer is also made to feel like a true observer in the room through a combination of the documentary filming style and how the camera holds on the characters for such an uncomfortably long time.
Good girl. That's a joke we were doing. Well done, settling in.
You can't do anything but sit there and bask in the awkwardness and wait for it to finally end, which is just what Ricky is doing here too. In the Seedy Boss pilot, however, this same interaction plays out somewhat similarly up until the point that David reveals it was all a joke, but from there the scene deviates a lot. June, which is Dawn's name in the pilot by the way, is a lot more aggressive and vocal about her dislike of David. In the original, the gravity of the awkwardness is made apparent by just how little Dawn says,
"You wanker."
A strong, firm statement. You wanker. She's not joking around, she's not remotely impressed by his antics. Dawn is truly pissed off, and how little she says only emphasises this. Here, June goes off on this whole tirade of calling David a pervert, saying how he likes to make women cry, and saying he's terrible to work under.
Okay, well that's it.
You're a fucking pervert!
That's
Do you
it.
realise that?
Yeah, well
Do you
done.
have any idea what it's like to work for you? You get off on this, don't you?
That's it now.
You like to make women cry.
To which David responds by saying he's never touched her, and says he isn't mad because if he was, he'd slap the slut, in this really seething, vindictive tone.
Tony can. Oh, Tony can have a laugh. I've never touched you. Slap that slut.
It's just so odd. Is that the best way to put it? Unfitting? I don't know. Tonally it just feels very strange and paints David in a completely different light to the way he's shown in the actual series. You're hearing this accusation that David is potentially a pervert, and you see him get violent and have to try and calm himself down. It's clear they were going for something very different with David at this point. To be honest, I don't think that the pilot's approach to David makes him seem as complex or as interesting as he is in the actual series, and that goes for him in the whole episode really, not just this one scene. One of the key aspects of David's character is that he hides behind a wall of lies, jokes, innuendo, quotes and rhetorical questions that mean you rarely feel like you're actually seeing his true self. It always seems like he's making a very conscious effort to present himself in a certain way, and so when you see moments in which he breaks this act and shows his true self, it really hits you hard. The scene where David begs to not be made redundant, for example, he drops all the weird witticisms and bravado and shows vulnerability, something he so obviously normally tries to hide. It hits you hard and shows you how well of a constructed character David is. Same with the scene where he's drinking alone in his shitty hotel room and falls asleep with the camera still rolling. His overt displays of weakness are so rare that when you see them they really do get emotion out of you and give you that real close connection to a guy that is so often written off as a one-dimensional bad boss. I feel like that aspect of his character is completely lost with this seedy boss David. Obviously we only have this single episode to go off, but with him being so willing to express vulnerability and anger even around someone he's trying to impress in Ricky, I don't think it makes for as much of an interesting character. Like, I don't feel there is as much to gain from an in-depth look at him over the length of a whole series, because he's putting all his cards on the table in the very first episode.
I'm mad, yeah. I was mad. I'd slap that slut.
It's just a lot more blunt and less subtle, and that subtlety is what really makes David work in my opinion. Though I can't deny that this interpretation of David isn't interesting at least, because characterising him differently like this would obviously lead to a lot of differences in interactions during other potential plot points from The Office. It's certainly provocative if nothing else, but I think Ricky and Steven definitely made the correct decision in changing this aspect of David's character, and this aggressive, seemingly weak to crumble David is almost unthinkable within the context of a lot of scenes that happen within The Office. Plus I think it'd make it a lot harder to sympathise with him later down the road if June's accusations were all completely true and he continued with this aggressive behaviour.
Slow down, you move too fast. Solomon's here.
The idea that David is a bit more blunt and straightforward with the way he acts is also visible in other scenes, mainly those involving Karen Roper, whose role was kept for the actual series too, with the same actress and everything. Like at one point David goes through her handbag, pulls out some lipstick and puts it on. It's definitely funny and isn't a gag used in the actual series, but it's kinda goofy. His general sleaze around Karen is almost overly comical too, and I think they may have gone a bit too far with it. David feels a bit too much like a wacky comedy character and less like a real person in a few scenes in this demo, which is something that Ricky and Steven were clearly not going for, and so they removed these more wacky aspects of his personality in the actual series, or at least toned them down. Though with this really prevalent sleazy behaviour, along with David's main descriptor here being Seedy in the series title, it may have been a case that during development, this lustful side of David was going to be much more of a focal point of his personality. Obviously his creepy behaviour around women is present in the David that we eventually got in The Office, but it comes across as more of a byproduct of his desire to seem young, popular and successful, rather than this overt, almost perverse behaviour that he exhibits in the pilot. Outside of personality differences, there are also just other general character details that are stated in this pilot that are different to the actual series. David says that he lives with his parents.
She looks after me. I still live with her.
And also, if you can believe it, has a wife.
That's it, so my wife's gonna see that.
The latter of which certainly makes the pervert accusation and attempts to flirt with Karen Roper seem a bit more interesting. Dialogue-wise, David is still pretty good in this pilot. A lot of lines here are ones that were eventually used in the actual series, and there's also quite a lot that weren't used that totally should have been.
We'll do a double act, little and large. The Joker and the comedian.
His body language and small little hand gestures are really good here too, and these are a big part of what makes David so good. If you ever watch Ricky play David Brent closely, you'll notice that he's always moving his head or doing something with his arms. He's actually quite a physical character, and it's cool to see that this part of him was already pretty well implemented at this early stage. But now I guess I should talk about The Office. Not The Office, but the office that David works in. It's not Wernham Hogg, the paper merchant's office in Slough, but rather Entech, who are in the wood, pulp, bleach and dye industry and are based in Staffordshire.
For the last 6 years, he's been managing director here at Entech in Staffordshire.
Obviously what his office does is pretty much the same joke really, that David works in an incredibly mundane and mostly faceless industry that nobody really thinks about, but I find it pretty interesting that they picked Staffordshire as the hub for the show. The office being set in Slough, which is in Berkshire, was chosen because it's a place near where Ricky grew up, in Reading, which is also in Berkshire. He seems to have a pretty deep connection to the general Berkshire area, and so it was written into David's character a fair amount, like when David reads John Betjeman's poem Slough, or when he does his famous "Slough's a big place" line that introduced the world to places like Winnersh. Plus he even did a song about Slough for the Life on the Road movie.
Oh, Slough.
David's connection to this general part of the world is a pretty intrinsic part of his character, so it's quite the eye-opener that he was originally meant to be in Staffordshire, somewhere that I'm not familiar with Ricky or Stephen having any prior connection to. I guess it was just deemed a boring county. So sorry, Staffordshire-ians? Staffs? I'm not quite sure what the correct demonym is. There's some differences within the building itself that I think give the show quite a bit of a different feel. For one, the office seems quite a lot bigger than the one that we got in the actual series, and yet it's also got a lot more walls and partitions than in Wernham Hogg. For me, these two factors make the office feel a lot more cold and less social, as you couldn't flow through the room freely like David ends up doing a lot in the actual series, and it'd mean that less people in the building would be exposed to him. It'd be easy to hide away from David's antics, something which would make a lot of the good scenes in the office impossible. Though this closed-off feel is used for some visual gags in the demo and allows for perhaps more moments for the camera to focus on characters who otherwise think they're alone, so it's not entirely just a less interesting version of the Wernham Hogg building, just different, and definitely does have some benefits. Though I imagine with this being a low-budget demo and all, there were not ample locations to choose from, and so perfectly fine-tuning a building's interior for a day or two of filming may not have been the best use of the available funds. There's also some pretty loud background generic office noise audio that, in combination with the fact that there always seems to be extras walking around in the background, makes the office actually seem quite busy. That's the theme that I get from this pilot really, that the company David works for is going to be larger and more successful than Wernham Hogg ended up being. Entech in the pilot is also said to have multiple managers working at it, which makes it seem like David's role is more important than his regional manager role at Wernham Hogg, seeing as he's the boss here.
This is where most of the PAs and the managers work.
But as I've talked about David so much, I guess it'd be time to bring up some of the other characters in the pilot, or rather some of the characters that aren't in the pilot. Tim and Gareth, two of the four main characters in the office, are not present at all here. It's pretty crazy. These two play such an integral role to the show in every aspect that them not being present, not even in an unfinished conceptual way, is really quite jarring. Both of those two guys play very important parts in The Office. Tim provides a lot of the cynicism and reactionary comments to the show, while also being one of the main proponents of emotion and heartbreak, whereas Gareth is one of the main facets of straight up comedy and hijinks in the show, and so those two simply not existing definitely leaves gaps in certain areas. Though I'd say that those gaps really aren't too apparent in this specific demo itself, as obviously it's only 20 minutes long and you aren't really engaged in a deep story yet. It does make you wonder about the writing process for the show though. Like, at what point of the production did they come up with the idea with Gareth and Tim? Were they drawn out of a reaction to the demo itself, or did they arise from needing to have more characters to be able to fill out a whole series worth of episodes? For being such an integral part of The Office, it's incredible to think that they were relatively late additions, seeing as characters like Dawn, Ricky, and even Taffy are present in the pilot. Stephen Merchant actually has a role in the pilot too, playing a character that goes unnamed but is spoken to by David. Steve obviously played Nathan, the Og monster in the real show, but this guy he's playing in this pilot is definitely not the same character, and actually works in The Office unlike Oggy. Though interestingly, a theme is shared between the two roles he plays, in that his character initially plays along with David, but then gets offended and annoyed by his antics, leading to an awkward situation. I also have to bring up a line that David says during a talking head segment after talking to Steve's character.
Do you know what I call alternative comedians? Alternative to comedians.
That is such a brilliant David line, it's hilarious. I wonder why that never made it into the actual series. Another guy that plays a different role in the pilot to the one they play in the actual series is Tony McMurray, who plays Ricky the Temp in this pilot, and a minor background character named after himself, Tony, in The Office. He's okay, I guess, but I don't think he works as well as Oliver Chris, who later played Ricky. A big part of Ricky's character was that he was a young, pretty attractive guy that David and Gareth would feel jealous of, and I don't think he fits that role visually, but to be fair, that plot point probably hadn't been thought of at this point. Ricky in this demo essentially plays the role of the office whipping boy who gets made fun of, but also serves a narrative purpose as he is introduced to people and gets things to explain to him, thus doing the same for the viewers. Ricky in the full series has this cool, kinda laid back attitude and is also pretty intelligent. He certainly knows his Dostoevsky. Whereas in this pilot he is made to look like a fool when he gets pranked into blowing up an inflatable sofa and subsequently looks embarrassed. Again, it's just one of those differences where I can't say it's bad or anything, it's just an earlier interpretation of a character's role, and so isn't as refined or developed as it'd eventually be in The Office. Glyn, or Taffy as he likes to be called, makes an appearance here too. I say an appearance because it literally is just that. He gets shown for a few seconds when David fails at getting his attention.
Taffy. Taff. Glyn.
It's the same joke used in The Office where David is only able to get him to look around when he calls him Glyn, but instead of being a gruff warehouse foreman, he's just some guy at a desk. The good idea is there, but its execution is certainly not as funny as it was in The Office. But to be honest, I think that what makes the character really work is David Shaw's performance in the series, and so without him being cast yet, it's never going to really feel like Taffy. Then onto Dawn, or June as she's called I guess. While for a lot of the other characters I've said that I think they're just less refined versions of their eventual roles, I don't think the same can really be said for June. She is nowhere near the level of brilliance that Dawn was in The Office. She feels very different as a character, and not only is she not written as well as Dawn is, but the actress that plays her doesn't do a particularly good job either in my opinion, which is strange considering she's like the second most important character in the pilot. I think partly this is due to her, well, simply not being Dawn Tinsley. Dawn's troubled relationship with Lee, not present with June. Dawn's will they won't they relationship with Tim, not present with June. Dawn's lack of purpose in her life and being too timid to do anything about it, not present with June. Plus she looks different, is a lot more vocal and seems more socially invested in The Office than Dawn did. Essentially, she comes across completely differently and isn't really the same character. She's similar to David in that she's a lot more outwardly expressive of her emotions than she would eventually become in The Office, and I think that's a detriment to her character, as she, perhaps more than anyone else in the series, really relied on this constantly nagging tension to develop her as a character. On the surface, she didn't really come across as a very interesting person. She was a girl next door type with a stable job and a fiance, yet over the course of the documentary we realise there's a lot more to her than meets the eye, and we become increasingly more aware of her issues that she's almost too scared to overcome, well, until the end of the Christmas special. Whereas with June, she's not going to be a reserve character because we see her get angry and boisterous in the first episode.
You're a fucking pervert! Do you realise that?
Yeah.
She doesn't seem particularly unhappy with her job as she somewhat plays the part of the office joker.
No, it doesn't work, no.
I don't really see the potential here. She just seems more like someone that exists so that David can do his thing, rather than being a character that we're also supposed to get invested in. Plus her obviously not having Tim and Gareth to riff off leaves us lacking scenes in which she may act differently, or show a different side to her personality. Now you could argue that it's unreasonable to expect a character to be fleshed out and characterised so well in a 20-minute episode in which they're not even the main focus, and I do partially agree with that. But I just feel like The Office managed to do a lot more with the Dawn role in a short space of time than this demo did. But you know, it is exactly that, a demo, and so I don't want to be too harsh on the June character. She is very much a work in progress, it's just more apparent with her than with any other character. Maybe it's also a result of Lucy Davis just being a better actress than this woman too, I don't know.
You've said that one before.
But now I'd also like to bring up the more technical parts of the demo, that being the camera work, the talking heads and the voiceover. Yes, you heard me right, voiceover. The Seedy Boss demo includes a voiceover done by Stephen Merchant in the style of real documentaries that use them for exposition or to establish something that may not have been easy to show on camera.
Karen is here for a new PA position. A confusion over the interview dates means she's the only candidate.
This was later removed for the actual series, and to be honest, I think that was the right decision to make. While it possibly had the potential to be used for comedic effect, it isn't used that way in this demo, and instead, if anything, kinda hinders some potential comedy. Like, you know that bit at the start of the episode Charity in The Office where the show slowly makes the scene funnier and funnier by first having David put the nose on, then Keith enters the frame dressed as Ali G, then Gareth hops in? It's funny because you don't really know what's going on, and you can't anticipate what will happen next. Imagine if that scene instead started with a voiceover saying, "It's Comic Relief Day and everyone at NTech is getting in the spirit," or something along those lines. Like, we don't really need to be told what's going to happen, just let it happen naturally. Same thing with the line that introduces us to David Brent.
David Brent has been in the wood pulp, bleach and dye business for 15 years.
Like, I really don't think it's necessary. But as far as I can understand from some of the articles I've read about the background to The Office, it was originally intended to be much more of a spoof of TV docusoaps in general, rather than being a comedy that happens to be shot in a documentary format. This is the reason for the voiceover, as it's much more necessary in an actual documentary, as you don't really have the time to let characters be established naturally, and you can't rely on background information arising without being prompted. There's a quote from series producer Asha Tala about the removal of the voiceover that indicates this well. "It was strong enough anyway, beautifully observed, with the strength coming from the characters, it didn't need to make fun of TV as well." This, in combination with the fact that the talking head scenes were in the pilot and remained in the actual series, really indicates that the focus of the show switched at some point during production. The show essentially went from a parody of late 90s docusoaps that was mocking the idea of making a celebrity out of a likely bad person, to a legitimate sitcom shot in a mockumentary format that stands on its own feet as a genuine comedy rather than just mocking an existing idea. They kept the talking heads as they are a genuine means of developing the characters and giving us an insight into parts of their personalities they'd perhaps not want to be so open with in front of the rest of the office, yet cut the voiceover that only really served to be a constant reminder of the fact that you were supposed to be watching a documentary.
Ricky Howard is the firm's new recruit.
The right decisions were definitely made there in my opinion. But the thing I find really interesting here about this whole discussion of the documentary format is that it originally wasn't even something that had much thought put into it. The documentary filming style was originally only chosen as Stephen had a limited amount of time to make the project and wanted to use a style that would be quick and easy to shoot. And it was only after using it for these practical reasons that they realised that there were benefits to this style in both a comedic and dramatic way too. That's pretty crazy when you think about it, considering that The Office has essentially become the poster child of this mockumentary format and was the inspiration for so many great shows in a similar format that have aired since, yet its style was born out of the circumstance rather than any sort of artistic vision. Though, as is obvious throughout the development of the pilots to the show, this format became more and more ingrained into the inner workings of the Seedy Boss and would eventually become one of its main elements, as I've previously spoken about. But as is probably not a surprise to anyone, I absolutely love the mockumentary style and I think it adds so much to a show like The Office. Absolutely fantastic moments of the show, like the bit where Tim takes his lapel mic off before asking Dawn out for the second time, wouldn't be possible if it was shot like a normal sitcom, and I think moments like this are its greatest attribute really. It allows the smaller things to be captured and the little details that are only apparent because the characters know we're watching them being filmed. And so yeah, there's definitely no objections from me about sticking to this style that the Seedy Boss only adopted out of necessity.
I'm a joker. I'm a smoker.
I don't smoke.
Although I guess something to note is that while the overarching format of the mockumentary is present from the Seedy Boss to The Office, the way in which the cameras are actually used feels a lot different here. It's a lot less documentarian and is obviously being used to try and create comedy itself rather than just being a means of capturing the comedy that is occurring naturally. The camera work is a lot more full on, which not only eliminates a lot of the feelings of monotony and tiredness in the workplace like The Office achieved with its intentionally dull, flat shots, but also is kind of distracting at moments. God knows how many times I've referred back to it at this point, but that scene where June calls David a pervert and the two argue ends in a way which I'm really not a fan of. David stands up, purposefully hits his head on the cupboard, causing the thing on the top to start shaking. Is that the pepperami animal thing? But yeah, this scene shows that the camera itself is being used for comedic effect, and I think it just comes across a bit goofy and like it's trying a bit too hard. Like, realistically, the camera would not be able to get this close to the characters without being incredibly annoying. It's just so ridiculously close to David at some points that it completely loses the documentary feel. Plus, the whole thing with going right close up on the Pepper Army guy wouldn't be what you'd even want to film in this documentary, right? Like, wouldn't the idea of the documentary be to record the characters' reactions here and not the wacky shaking meat snack? Again, it's an example of this early iteration of the show being much more of a spoof or mockery of the docusoap idea rather than a character-based sitcom. This leads to it falling into the pitfalls of trying to make comedy at moments where it wouldn't occur naturally, like here, which I can't say I'm too much of a fan of. I'm much more of the opinion that you should show, not tell, in that we should know that moments are supposed to be funny because of the dialogue and body language of the characters, and not because the camera tells us that something is funny by doing something wacky or abnormal. This is a philosophy that The Office stuck to and definitely did well, and so this is for sure an idea of the Seedy boss that saw a lot of changes as the idea went on. The Seedy boss demo just in general has somewhat of an amateurish feel, which obviously makes sense given that it was filmed on a tight schedule with a limited budget and was made by people with little to no experience. Yet strangely, in a way, I think it actually adds charm to the overall product. Like, on the one hand, you could see moments like this where the boom mic keeps going in and out of frame as technical errors, which they probably were in actuality, but at the same time they do actually work within the context of the show. The camera isn't ignored in the Seedy boss, everyone knows they're being recorded, and so moments in which the film's crew's presence becomes apparent to us as a viewer makes the show feel more natural than anything. In my review of the David Brent Life on the Road film, one of the only things I pointed out that I liked was the moment where a character is not mic'd up and so as to point the camera crew in the direction of David when he's doing something embarrassing so they can film it, and I said this idea was a good example of making the documentary format seem more genuine. That bit was obviously done on purpose, and things like microphones being in frame was likely not, but they do somewhat achieve the same goal. I like these imperfections in mockumentaries, you know, but maybe I'm just weird. As for other things to talk about in this demo, there's the actual events that happen, I guess. As is probably clear by some of the things that I've said before, many of the things that happen here were kept and were used later in The Office, so it'd probably be more interesting to talk about the things from the Seedy boss that were discarded. I mentioned Stephen Merchant's character earlier, who was dropped and Steve later plays Oggy instead, and there's the bit where David put some lipstick that was cut, but the Seedy boss also includes the sequence in which Ricky, the new temp, is asked to blow up an inflatable sofa, which unbeknownst to him doesn't work, so I guess it has a hole in it or something. These bits are probably my least favourite parts of the pilot, as well, they aren't really that funny. I'd say it isn't really all that funny because you're left feeling kind of like Ricky here. We don't know anything about this sofa, and we don't know that it's part of an in-office joke, so when we find out that it doesn't work and that they were wasting his time for a laugh, you're not really seeing any sort of payoff as a viewer, as it's only something that's funny for the other characters in the scene. Yeah, not really surprised that they dropped this idea, to be honest, and instead of the inflatable sofa, we eventually got an inflatable cock instead. So yeah, this demo of the Seedy boss from 1998 is pretty interesting overall. You really can see that the foundations of certain elements of The Office were already firmly established by this point, but it's also apparent that everything's just slightly off and needs refining. It's funny, because on the one hand I want to say that it really isn't too different to how The Office turned out, yet at the same time I want to say that it's very different. Like, not having Tim or Gareth present makes it hard to think of this product as The Office, yet it manages to capture a lot of the same ideas and atmosphere that'd be present there. But it's clear from watching the Seedy boss that there was definitely a lot of potential here, and I'm not surprised that this demo led to interest from those at the BBC, because despite its imperfections, it's still perfectly watchable even now. So good job, Ricky and Steve. You weren't a half bad duo, were you?